Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the continuation of Lord of the Flies. I'm at page 18 at this very moment, and I'm going to continue a little bit. Thank you so much for coming back and listening to me and the story, of course. Here we go. He went very pink, bowed his head, and cleaned his glasses again. Finally, the laughter died away, and the naming continued. There was Maurice, next in size among the choir boys to Jack, but broad and grinning all the time. There was a slight, furtive boy whom no one knew, who kept himself with an inner intensity of avoidance and secrecy. He muttered that his name was Roger, and was silent again. Bill, Robert, Harold, Henry, a choir boy who had fainted, sat up against a palm trunk, smiled piteously at Ralph, and said that his name was Simon. Jack spoke. "We've got to decide about being rescued." There was a buzz. One of the small boys, Henry, said that he wanted to go home. "Shut up," said Ralph, absently. He lifted the conch. "Seems to me we ought to have a chief to decide things." A chief! I ought to be a chief," said Jack with simple arrogance, "because I'm chapter chorister and head boy. I can sing C sharp." Another buzz. "Well then," said Jack, "I..." He hesitated. The dog boy, Roger, stirred at last and spoke up. "Let's have a vote." "Yes! Vote for a chief. Let's vote." This toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch. Jack started to protest, but the glamour changed from the general wish for a chief to an election, to a claim of Ralph himself. None of the boys have found good reason for this. What intelligence had been shown was traceable to Piggy, while the most obvious leader was Jack. But there was a stillness about Ralph as he said that marked him out. There was his size and attractive appearance, and most obscurely, yet most powerfully, there was a conch. The being that had blown that had sat waiting for them on the platform, with the delicate thing balanced on his knees, was set apart. Him with the shell. Ralph! Let him be chief with the trumpet thing." Ralph raised a hand for silence. "All right, who wants Jack for chief?" With daring obedience, the choir raised their hands. "Who wants me?" Every hand outside the choir except Piggy was raised immediately. Then Piggy too raised his hand, grudgingly, into the air. Ralph counted. "I'm chief then." The circle of boys broke into applause. Even the choir applauded, and the freckles on Jack's face disappeared under a blush of mortification. He started up, then changed his mind and sat down again while the air rang. Ralph looked at him, eager to offer something. "The choir belongs to you, of course. They could be an army, or hunters. They could be..." A suffusion drained away from Jack's face. Ralph waved again for silence. "Jack's in charge of the choir. They can be what you want them to be. Hunters." Jack and Ralph smiled at each other with shy liking. The rest began to talk eagerly. Jack stood up. "All right, choir, take off your tongues." Talks? I think talks is the word, yeah, sorry. Yeah, there are gonna be a couple of words in this book that I don't really understand. So I'm gonna try to do my best to pronounce it in the correct way. My apologies if I'm not really pronouncing it correctly, but I will try to do my best. As if released from class, the choir boys stood up, shattered, piled their black cloaks on the grass. Jack laid his on the trunk by Ralph. His grey shorts were sticking to him with sweat. Ralph glanced at him admiringly, and when Jack saw his glance, he explained, "I tried to get over that hill to see if there was water all around, but your shout called us." Ralph smiled and held up the guns for silence. "Listen, everybody, I've got to have time to think things out. I can't decide what to do straight off. If this isn't an island, we might be rescued straight away. So we've got to decide if this is an island. Everybody must stay around here and wait and not go away. 3 of us. If we take more, we'll get all mixed and lose each other. 3 of us will go on an expedition and find out. I'll go, and Jack and he looked around the circle of eager faces. There was no lack of boys to choose from. And Simon. The boys around Simon giggled, and he stood up, laughing a little. Now that the pallor of this feint was over, he was a skinny, vivid little boy with a glance coming up from under a herd of straight hair that hung down, black and coarse. He nodded at Ralph. "I'll come." And Jack snatched from behind him a sizable sheath knife, clawed into the trunk. The buzz rose and died away. Piggy stirred. "I'll come." Ralph turned to him. "You're no good on a job like this. All the same, we don't want you," said Jack flatly. "Three's enough." Piggy's glasses flashed. "I was with him when he found the conch. I was with him before anyone else was." Jack and the others paid no attention. There was a general dispersal. Ralph, Jack, and Simon jumped off the platform and walked along the sand past the baiting pool. Piggy hung, bubbling, behind them. "If Simon walks in the middle of us," said Ralph, "then we could talk over his head." The 3 of them fell into step. This meant that every now and then Simon had to do a double shuffle to catch up with the others. Presently, Ralph stopped and turned back to Piggy. "Look." Jack and Simon pretended to notice nothing. They walked on. "You can't come." Piggy's glasses were misted again, this time with humiliation. "You told him after what I said." His face flushed. His mouth trembled. "After I said I didn't want." "What on earth are you talking about?" "About being called Piggy. I said I didn't care as long as they didn't call me Piggy, and I said not to call. And then you went on straight out." Stillness descended on them. Ralph, looking with more understanding at Piggy, saw that he was hurt and crushed. He hovered between the 2 courses of apology and further insult. "Better Piggy than Fatty," he said he last, with the directness of genuine leadership. "And anyway, I'm sorry if you feel like that. Now go back, Piggy, and take names. That's your job. So long." He turned and raced after the other 2. Piggy stood, and the rose of indignation faded slowly from his cheeks. He went back to the platform. The 3 boys walked briskly on the sand. The tide was low, and there was a strip of weed-strewn beach that was almost as firm as a road. A kind of glamour was spread over them, and the scene, they were conscious over the glamour and made happy by it. They turned to each other, laughing, excitedly, talking, not listening. The air was bright. Ralph, faced by the task of translating all this into explanation, stood on his head and fell over. When they had done laughing, Simon stroked Ralph's arm shyly, and they had to laugh again. "Come on," said Jack presently. "We're explorers. We'll go to the end of the island," said Ralph, "and look around the corner, if it's an island." Now, towards the end of the afternoon, the mirage was settling a little. They found the end of the island, quite distinct and not magicked out of shape or sense. It was a jumble of unusual squareness, with one great block sitting out in the lagoon. seabirds were nesting there. Like icing, said Ralph, on a pink cake. We shan't see round this corner, said Jack. Because there isn't one. Only a slow curve. And you can see the rocks were worse. The rocks got worse. Sorry. Ralph shaded his eyes and followed the jagged outline of the cracks up towards the mountain. This part of the beach was nearer the mountain than any other than he had seen. We'll try climbing the mountain from here, he said. I should think this is the easiest way. There's less of that jungle stuff and more pink rock. Come on, the three boys began to scramble up. Some unknown force had wrenched and shoved these cubes so that they lay asked, often piled diminishingly on each other. The most usual feature of the rock was a pink cliff surmounted by skewed block, and that again surmounted, and that again, till the pinkness became a slack of balanced rock projecting through the loop fantasy of the forest creepers. Where the pink cliffs rose out of the ground, there were often narrow tracks winding upwards. They could edge along them, deep in the plant world, their faces to the rock. What made this track? Jack paused, whipping the sweat from his face. Ralph stood by him, breathless. Men? Jack shook his head. Animals? Ralph peered into the darkness under the trees. The forest minutely vibrated. Come on. The difficulty was not the steep ascent around the shoulders of rock, but occasionally plunged through the undergrowth to get to the next path. Here the roots and stems of creepers were in such tangles that the boys had to tread through them like pliant needles, their only guide apart from the brown ground, and occasionally flashing of light through the foliage. Was the tendency of slope, whether this hole laced as it was with cables of creepers, stood higher than that. Somehow they moved up, mirrored in these tangles. At perhaps their most difficult moment, Ralph turned with shining eyes to the others. Wacko. Wizard. Smashing. The cause of their pleasure was not obvious. All three were hot, dirty, and exhausted. Ralph was badly scratched. The creepers were as thick as their thighs, and left little but tunnels for further penetration. Ralph shouted experimentally, and they listened to the muted echoes. This is real exploring, said Jack. I bet nobody's been here before. We ought to draw a map, said Ralph. Only we haven't any paper. We could make scratches on bark, said Simon, and rub black stuff in. Again, the solemn communion of shining eyes in the gloom. Wacko, wizard. There was no place for standing on one's head. This time Ralph experienced the intensity of its emotion by pretending to knock Simon down, and soon they were a happy, heaving pile in the underdusk. When they had fallen apart, Ralph spoke first. Got to go get on. The pink granite on the next cliff was furthest back from the creepers and trees so that they could trot up the path. This again led into more open forest, that they had a glimpse of the spread sea. With openness came the sun. It dried the sweat that had soaked their clothes in the dark, damp heat. At last, the way to the top looked like a scramble over pink rock. With no more plunging through darkness, the boys chose their way through defiled and over screes of sharp stone. Look! Look! High over this end of the island, the shattered rock lifted up their stacks and chimneys. This one, against which Jack learned, moved to the grating sound that they pushed. Come on! But not come on to the top. The assault on the summit must wait till the three boys accepted this challenge. The rock was as large as a small motor car. Heave. Sway back and forth. Catch the rhythm. Heave. Increase the swing of the pendulum. Increase. Come up. And bear against the point of furthest balance. Increase. Heave. The great rock loitered, posed on one toe, decided not to return, moved through the air, fell, struck, turned over, leaped droning through the air and smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. Echoes and birds flew. White and pink dust floated. The forest further down shook as with the passage of an enraged monster, and then the island was still. Wacko, like a bomb. Wee-haw! Not for 5 minutes could they drag themselves away from this triumph, but they left at last. The way to the top was easy after that. As they reached the last stretch, Ralph stopped. Golly! They were on the lip of the cirque, and a half cirque, in the side of the mountain. This was filled with a blue flower, a rock plant of some sort. The overglow hung down the vent and spilled lavishly among the canopy of the forest. The air was thick with butterflies, lifting, fluttering, settling. Beyond the cirque was the square top of the mountain, and soon they were standing on it. They had guessed before that this was an island clambering among the pink rocks, with the sea on their side and the crystal height of air. They had known by some instinct that the sea lay on every side. But there seemed something more fitting in leaving the last word till they stood on the top and could see a circular horizon of water. Ralph turned to the others. This belongs to us. It was roughly boat-shaped, humped near this end, with behind them the jumbled descent to the shore. On either side, rocks, cliffs, treetops, and a steep slope forward. There, the length of the boat, a tamer descent, tree-clad with hints of pink, and the jungly flat of the island, dense green, but drawn at the end to a pink tail. There, where the island pretended petered out in water. I have no idea what this word is. My apologies. Was another island, a rock, almost detached, standing like a fort, facing them across the green with one bold pink bastion. The boys survived all this, then looked out to sea. They were high up, and the afternoon had advanced. The view was not robbed of sharpness by mirage. That's a reef, a coral reef. I've seen pictures like that. The reef enclosed more than one side of the island, lying perhaps a mile out and parallel to what they now thought of their beach. The coral was scribbled in the sea, as though a giant had bent down to reproduce the shape of the island in a flowing chalk line, but tired before he had finished. Inside was peacock, water, rock, and wheat showing, as in an aquarium. Outside was the dark blue of the sea. The tide was running, so that long streaks of foam tailed away from the reef, and for a moment they felt that the boat was moving steadily astern. Jack pointed down. That's where we landed. Beyond falls and cliffs, there was a gash visible in the trees. There were the splintered trunks, and then the drag, leaving only a fridge of palm between the scar and the sea. There too, jutting into the lagoon, was a platform with insect-like figures moving near it. Welf sketched a twining line From the bald spot on which they stood down the slope, a gully through flowers, round and down to the rock where the scar started. That's the quickest way back. Eyes shining, mouths opened, triumphed. They severed the right of domination. They were lifted up. We're friends. There's no village smoke and no boats, said Ralph wisely. We'll make sure later, but I think it's uninhabited. We'll get food, cried Jack. Hunt, catch things, until they fetch us. Simon looked at them both, saying nothing, but nodding, till his black hair flopped backwards and forwards. His face was glowing. Ralph looked back to the other way, where there was no reef. Steeper, said Jack. Ralph made a cupping gesture. That bit of forest down there, the mountain holds it up. Even coin of the mountain held up trees, flowers, and trees. Now the forest stirred, roared, failed. The nearest acres of rock, flowers, flutters, and for half a minute the breeze blew cool on their faces. Ralph spread his arms. All ours. They laughed and tumbled, and shouted on the mountain, I'm hungry! When Simon mentioned his hunger, to others became aware of theirs. Come on, said Ralph. We found out what we want to know. They scrambled down a rock slope, dropped among flowers, and made their way among the trees. Here they paused, and examined the bushes around them carefully. Simon spoke first. Like candle bushes, candle buds. The bushes were dark evergreen and aromatic, and the many buds were waxed green and folded up against the light. Jack slashed at one with his knife, and the scent spilled over them. Candle buds. They couldn't light them, said Ralph. They just look like candles. Green candles, said Jack contemptuously. We can't eat them. Come on. They were in the beginning of the thick forest, clunking with weary feet on the track, when they heard the noises squeaking and the hard strike of hooves on the path. As they pushed forward, the squeaking increased till it became a frenzy. They found a piglet caught in a curtain of creepers, throwing itself in elastic traces in all the madness of extreme terror. Its voice was thin, needly sharp, and insistent. The three boys rushed forward, and Jack drew his knife against with a flourish. He raised his arm in the air. There came a pause. A hiatus. The pig continued to scream, and the creepers to jerk, and the blade continued to flash at the end of a bony arm. The pause was only long enough for them to understand what an enormity the downward stroke would be. Then the piglet tore loose from the creepers and scurried into the undergrowth. They were left looking at each other, a place of terror. Jack's face was white under the freckles. He noticed that he still held the knife aloft and brought his arm down, replacing the blade in the sheath. Then they all three laughed ashamedly and began to climb back to the track. I was choosing a place, said Jack. I was just waiting for a moment to decide where to stab him. You should stick a pig, said Ralph fiercely. They always talk about sticking a pig. You cut a pig's throat to let the blood out, said Jack. Otherwise, you can't eat the meat. Why didn't you? They knew very well why he hadn't, because of the enormity of the knife descending and cutting into living flesh, because of the unbearable blood. I was going to, said Jack. He was ahead of them, and they could not see his face. I was choosing a place. Next time. He snatched his knife out of the sheath and slammed into a tree trunk. Next time, there will be no mercy. He looked round fiercely, daring them to contradict. Then they broke out into sunlight. For a while, they were busy finding and devouring food as they moved down the scar towards the platform and the meeting. Thank you.